The sun was just beginning to rise over the ancient Colosseum, casting a pale light over its weathered stone arches. The arena, once home to a spectacle of blood and terror, now stood silent, yet still echoing the memories of those brutal games. The dust of yesterday's carnage clung stubbornly to the ground as the cold morning air stirred. Beneath the towering walls, the marketplace buzzed with activity. Vendors shouted to the masses, offering baskets of olives and watered wine, ready for the crowd that hadn't even gathered yet. But above the chatter, a low electric hum began to grow. The gates rattled as handlers pushed half-starved beasts into place. Lions, their ribs showing beneath their tawny fur, snarled in their cages. Elephants stamped their massive feet in protest. Panthers clawed desperately at the iron bars. The sounds grew louder, the tension rising as the inevitable approached. Iron swords were tested. They weren't being sharpened for practice, but for the day's bloodletting. And above it all, the crowds began to gather, tens of thousands of Romans eager for one thing: the spectacle of death, a show designed not only for entertainment, but as a grim reminder of the empire's power. They came for the most gruesome, the most inhumane acts that history has ever known. Imagine yourself in the stands of the Colosseum, surrounded by 50,000 Romans, cheering, shouting, thirsting for violence. Their eyes are glued to the sandy arena below, where gladiators will fight to the death, where beasts will maim and kill. This isn't just a fight for survival. It's a well-rehearsed performance, a carefully crafted show where every drop of blood spilled is a testament to the empire's power. You sit among the crowd, feeling the heat, the tension in the air. The excitement is palpable. But this isn't a game. This is death, packaged and presented as entertainment. The Colosseum isn't just a place for sport. It's a stage for Rome's darkest theatre, where cruelty is the currency, and the spectators are as much a part of the spectacle as the fighters themselves. This was the birthplace of the most brutal, bloodthirsty spectacle the world had ever known. And today, we're diving into the most brutal and inhumane arena acts that cross the line even for Rome. From blood-drenched funeral rites to executions staged as theatre, we'll uncover how an entire civilization built its reputation not just on victories, but on turning suffering into applause. The Colosseum wasn't just an arena, it was a symbol of Rome's immense power, its ability to dominate, and its deep-seated hunger for control. On any given day, the vast stone structure would come to life, buzzing with the anticipation of violence. The crowds would fill the seats, their murmurs and excited chatter growing louder as the time neared. From afar, the Colosseum might have looked like a monument to civilization, an architectural marvel, but up close, it was a constant reminder of Rome's obsession with dominance, a stage where life and death blurred into one, and the empire's true face was revealed. As the sun beat down on its arches, the arena was ready to welcome the Roman elite. Beneath the stone, amidst the scent of sweat and leather, vendors would hawk their wares, bread, wine, and trinkets, to fill the pockets of the excited crowd. It wasn't just a show, it was a ritual, a celebration of life and death, where power was displayed, not in words, but in the blood spilled on the arena's sands. The gladiatorial games had deep roots, born from funeral rites meant to honor the dead. But in Rome, it quickly evolved into something much darker. What began as a ritual sacrifice for the deceased would morph into a grand tool of political power, a way to keep the masses entertained and distracted, to consolidate the emperor's control, and to remind them of Rome's dominance. As the years passed, these games became less about honoring the dead and more about showcasing the empire's reach, its ability to conquer not only nations, but nature itself. The games weren't just entertainment. They were a machine of statecraft, and the emperors knew how to use them. By sponsoring the games, they didn't just gain favor from the people. They reminded everyone, from the highest senator to the lowest plebeian, that the emperor controlled life, death, and everything in between. The games were a reminder that the empire could keep its people under control, that they could feed the masses with blood and spectacle. The arena was more than just a place for fighters. It was a place where politics were performed, where every gladiator's fall was an affirmation of the emperor's absolute rule. In those early days, there was no thought of gladiators as athletes, nor of them as heroes. They were instruments of control, tools to keep the people in check, to remind them of the empire's might. The gladiators wore the armor of defeated enemies, a constant reminder of Rome's dominance. The Samnite with his shield and helmet, the Thracian with his curved blade, the Gaul with his longsword. All these representations of conquered peoples were designed to showcase Rome's eternal victory. And then, as the games evolved, so too did the arenas. What began as temporary wooden stands for small games gave way to the massive stone amphitheatres, the permanent temples to violence. By the time of the late Republic, the games were no longer a family affair. They belonged to the state. The arena was no longer just a gathering place for the elite. It was the property of the emperor, and through him, Rome. The arena, with its polished stone, gleaming weapons, and the deafening roar of the crowd, was a tool of propaganda. Each drop of blood spilled was a reminder that the empire could command not only men, but even death itself. The people cheered, and with every cheer, they reaffirmed the empire's grip on their hearts, minds, and very lives. The gladiatorial combat of ancient Rome was not a mere contest of strength or skill. It was a brutal, unrelenting spectacle, a fight not just for survival, but for the entertainment of thousands. The crowds roared with anticipation as two men, armed and ready, stepped into the arena. But these weren't just fighters, they were pawns in a larger game. A game where the stakes were life and death, and where survival depended on more than skill. It relied on the whims of the crowd and the whims of those who orchestrated the show. The gladiators were not free men. They were slaves, criminals, prisoners of war, forced into combat, often against their will. And those who were not condemned, the volunteers, the octorati, had their own motivations. Some came for glory, others for the promise of fame, and yet many fought for one reason only: survival. The promise of a life in the arena was far from glamorous. Gladiators were often poorly fed, poorly trained, and subjected to cruel, degrading conditions. But the worst part, the spectacle was always engineered for maximum brutality. The idea was not to showcase the skill of the combatants, but to maximize the bloodshed, to keep the audience on the edge of their seats, craving the next scream, the next wound. In the early days, the combat was simple, a fight to the death. But as time passed, the games became more intricate, more theatrical. The gladiators were matched not for skill, but for drama. Mismatches were engineered, and fights were staged for maximum suspense. The audience didn't want fair combat. They wanted chaos, tension, and fear. Gladiators were forced to fight with weapons that favored one combatant over the other. Some gladiators fought with heavy shields and swords, while others were armed with little more than a net and a trident. These mismatches created a false sense of excitement, as the crowd was kept guessing whether their favorite gladiator would survive or be torn apart by the odds stacked against him. But the most terrifying part of the gladiatorial games wasn't the combat itself, it was the psychological toll it took on the fighters. Imagine for a moment being forced to fight for your life every day. The arena wasn't just a physical battlefield, it was a psychological one. The gladiators had to suppress their fear, their instincts, and their humanity in order to survive. They were trained not only to fight, but to endure pain, to ignore wounds that would be fatal to anyone else. And they had to perform. The fight wasn't just about survival, it was a show. Gladiators had to entertain. They had to give the crowd what they wanted: blood, gore, and the thrill of watching another human being die. For the audience, this was a game of survival. For the gladiators, it was a game of endurance, where every cut, every bruise, every wound could be their last. And as the fights continued, the audience's hunger for more grew. The gladiators were no longer just combatants, they were characters in a grand story. Each match told a tale of survival, of victory, of death. And with every victory, the gladiator became a hero, someone to be admired by the masses. But for those who lost, the arena was their tomb. The crowds cheered for them as they died, their bodies discarded like nothing more than pieces in a game. But not every match was a fight to the death. Some gladiators were granted the chance to survive. After a particularly intense fight, a gladiator who had fought valiantly could be granted a reprieve. This reprieve was determined by the crowd, and more often than not, it depended on the emperor's whims. If the emperor saw fit, he could order a gladiator's life spared with a mere thumbs up or down. The crowd, too, played a crucial role. If they were pleased with a gladiator's performance, they would chant for his life to be spared. But if they were dissatisfied, if they wanted more blood, they would demand death. This system of survival and death created a sense of tension and unpredictability. The gladiators were at the mercy of the crowd and the emperor, with no way of knowing whether their life would end with a final blow, or whether they would be granted the gift of another day. But for the fighters, this uncertainty was part of the game. They lived with the knowledge that every time they stepped into the arena, they were gambling with their lives. The stakes were always high, and the outcome was never guaranteed. The cruelty wasn't just in the fights themselves, it was in the way the games were structured, in the way the gladiators were treated, in the way the audience reveled in their suffering. The arena became a stage for Rome's darkest desires, a place where death was turned into entertainment. The gladiators were not just fighters, they were victims of a system that used them for sport, for political gain, for the pleasure of the crowd. And as the games grew in popularity, so did the brutality. What began as simple combat evolved into a spectacle of terror, where the line between sport and murder was often blurred. In ancient Rome, executions were far from ordinary punishments. They were performances, carefully orchestrated to serve as public spectacles that reinforced the empire's power and control. The executioner wasn't simply carrying out a sentence, he was part of a twisted theatrical show. The arena was transformed into a stage where death was not just the end of life. It was a carefully crafted act, designed to entertain and frighten, to show the masses who truly held power. One of the most infamous forms of execution in the arena was damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. Prisoners, criminals, and slaves who had fallen out of favor were thrown into the arena, where wild animals, often starved and enraged, awaited their victims. This wasn't just about punishing the condemned. It was a demonstration of Rome's dominance over nature and humanity. The scene was horrific. The arena floor, soaked in blood, echoed with the roars of lions and the desperate cries of those who were thrown into the fray. As the animals mauled their victims, the crowd cheered, caught up in the macabre excitement of the spectacle. The victim's life was extinguished in front of thousands. But it wasn't just about the death, it was a reminder of Rome's ultimate control. Yet it wasn't just the animals that made these executions unique. The condemned were often forced to play roles in elaborate mythological reenactments. They were dressed as heroes and villains from ancient stories, only to meet a fate that mirrored the suffering and death the legends spoke of. One of the most famous reenactments was the myth of Orpheus, the musician who enchanted beasts with his music. In the arena, however, the reality was far more brutal. Orpheus would play his lyre, expecting the admiration of the crowd, only to be torn apart by a bear released from its cage. What was once a tale of beauty and art was twisted into a gruesome parody. In Rome, even the gods were not exempt from cruelty. The use of myth and execution was a calculated decision. The emperors and those who organized these spectacles understood the power of symbols. They knew that by turning legendary stories into horrifying realities, they could send a message to the people. The condemned weren't just dying, they were becoming symbols of Rome's unchallenged authority. Each death was a lesson, a warning to the masses about the consequences of defying the empire. When a prisoner was cast as a tragic hero and then brutally killed in the same way, the message was clear. Resistance was futile. Even the mightiest of gods and heroes could be humiliated and destroyed for the entertainment of the masses. But it wasn't only mythological figures who were used in these executions. Prisoners and gladiators were also forced to reenact historical battles. These mock wars, sometimes involving entire squads or armies, were staged to resemble famous victories or violent events from Roman history. The violence was carefully choreographed, but the suffering was all too real. These reenactments weren't just for the purpose of reminding the citizens of Rome's victories, they were propaganda, reinforcing the idea that the empire could manipulate not only the present, but also the past. Rome was the eternal victor, even in death. Another form of execution often seen in the arena was crucifixion, a punishment the Romans had perfected for public displays. The condemned would be nailed to wooden crosses, their agonizing deaths carried out before a watching crowd. Sometimes these executions were part of the performance itself. Victims, often slaves or criminals, would be dressed in elaborate costumes, their slow, painful deaths becoming part of the theatre. The crowd would watch in morbid fascination, while vendors continued to sell their wares, as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. For the Romans, crucifixion wasn't just about punishing the guilty, it was about sending a message, about reminding the people who controlled their fate and what could happen to those who disobeyed. Executions by fire were another gruesome form of punishment. Victims were often dressed in a tunica molesta, a garment soaked in pitch or resin and set alight. The condemned would become living torches, their screams filling the air as they staggered in the flames. These horrific displays were designed to shock the audience, to remind them of the emperor's absolute power. Death by fire wasn't just a punishment, it was a public show, a reminder that the emperor had control over life and death itself. The victim's suffering became part of the spectacle, and the audience reveled in the grotesque display. Each execution was a piece of carefully choreographed theatre. It wasn't just about killing criminals, it was about delivering a public lesson, one that reinforced Rome's power. Each death in the arena told a story about who controlled the people, who could decide who lived and who died, and who could turn death into a spectacle for the masses. And for those in the stands, it wasn't just about the bloodshed. It was part of the entertainment, part of the spectacle that kept them enthralled, passive, and obedient to the empire. The Roman arena wasn't just a stage for human combat. It was also a showcase for the empire's ability to conquer the wild. Exotic animals, dragged from the farthest corners of the empire, were symbols of Roman dominance. Lions from North Africa, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles from the Nile, these creatures weren't brought to the Colosseum to be admired, but to be destroyed. They were victims in a display of power, showing that Rome's reach extended even to the most dangerous and untamable beasts. Imagine the scene. A massive crowd roars as wild animals are paraded into the arena, their chains rattling as they are forced into an unnatural space. The audience is hungry for blood, not just from gladiators, but from these exotic creatures. Capturing and displaying them wasn't about marveling at nature's beauty, it was about control. Rome wasn't just taming animals, it was taming the natural world itself, proving that it could dominate even the untamable. For emperors, these animals were living trophies. The rarer the creature, the greater the symbol of power. Julius Caesar, known for his grand spectacles, introduced the first giraffe seen in Europe in 46 BC. Romans, having never seen such a creature, called it a camelopard, half camel, half leopard. The animal didn't survive long. It was thrown into the arena, torn apart by the crowd's demand for blood. For Caesar, the message was clear. If Rome could capture the wildest creatures, it could conquer anything. This wasn't just an occasional show, it became a political tool. Emperors like Titus, at the inauguration of the Colosseum in AD 80, set the bar high. It is said that Titus killed over 9,000 animals in just one festival. These weren't just exotic creatures, they were paraded, starved, and then released into the arena, often pitted against armed hunters called bestiarii. The beasts, weakened and desperate, fought not for survival but for the amusement of an audience eager for violence. Some animals were even forced to fight one another, turning the arena into a savage battlefield, where the crowd's bloodlust could be fully indulged. But it wasn't just the animals' physical prowess that mattered, it was their exoticness. The more distant and dangerous the animal, the more it symbolized the reach of Rome. Elephants, lions, and crocodiles were brought from places like North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia Minor regions that had fallen under Roman control. The scale of the violence was staggering. Lions and bears were deliberately starved before being released, ensuring a bloody, one-sided fight. Elephants, once feared by Roman soldiers, were dragged into the sand and butchered for the crowd's pleasure. The message was clear. Rome was omnipotent, its reach extending across continents. These animals weren't just marvels of nature, they were trophies of conquest. Their suffering was a reminder of Rome's power. The empire had control over everything, even the wildest creatures on earth. The hunts, known as venaciones, became larger and more extravagant over time. They weren't just about showcasing exotic creatures, they were about showing power over them. Emperors boasted of their ability to capture and transport the wildest animals. Caravans crossed deserts to bring lions and elephants, while ships carried them across seas. The animal's journey was part of the spectacle, a display of Rome's ability to control both the known and the unknown. For the Romans, this was more than just entertainment. Conquering nature was as important as conquering nations. The animals in the arena were symbols of the empire's vastness. They were captured, tortured, and killed not for survival but for amusement. And in doing so, Rome demonstrated that nothing, whether human or animal, was beyond its reach. The arena was more than just a stage for entertainment. It became a place where emperors could flaunt their power, vanity, and control over the masses. For some rulers, the games were not just a political tool, but a personal stage where they could shine. Emperors like Caligula and Commodus used the Colosseum not only to sponsor the games, but to star in them, turning themselves into larger-than-life figures in front of thousands of cheering Romans. Commodus, known for his obsession with his own image, became infamous for his involvement in the arena. He didn't simply fund the games, he participated in them. Dressed as Hercules, he would enter the arena wielding a club and a bow, ready to kill hundreds of animals. But these fights weren't fair. Commodus didn't face the same risks as the gladiators. His animals were often disabled or tied up, ensuring his victory before the battle even began. The crowd cheered, not out of admiration but out of fear. Commodus had forced their applause. For him, the arena was not about proving strength or leadership. It was about creating a spectacle where he was the god-like champion. It didn't matter that these extravagant games drained the state's resources. What mattered was that the audience believed in his invincibility. He even charged the state treasury for his performances, draining the empire's coffers to fund his obsession with fame. Commodus's vanity ultimately led him down a dangerous path. His increasing focus on solidifying his image alienated those around him, leading to his eventual violent death. Caligula, another notorious emperor, also used the arena to enhance his personal image. Known for his cruelty, Caligula blurred the lines between ruler and entertainer. During his reign, the Colosseum became more than a place of bloodshed, it became his platform for power. In a twisted show of dominance, he once ordered innocent spectators to be dragged into the arena when animal supplies ran low. The audience, instead of watching from the stands, found themselves at the mercy of the emperor, becoming part of the spectacle. For Caligula, this wasn't merely about violence, it was about control. The arena was the perfect place for him to show that he could do anything, even decide who lived and who died. He wasn't just an emperor, he was a performer, and the Colosseum was his stage. His unpredictability kept the people on edge, never knowing when the next show would turn into their worst nightmare. Caligula's use of the arena was a demonstration of his unhinged power. He wanted the people to fear him, to see him as a ruler who could act with impunity. Other emperors, like Nero, also used the arena for personal vanity, but in a different way. Nero, obsessed with his image as an artist, preferred the stage to the arena. However, he still used the games to maintain control and win attention. He arranged elaborate performances that combined theatre with punishment. Prisoners were dressed as characters from Greek tragedies and killed in ways that reflected the roles they were forced to play. Nero claimed it was art, an elevated performance for the audience. His critics, however, saw it as madness. For Nero, the arena was a place where he could show off his artistic brilliance, even at the cost of human life. The public executions of these performers were just another way to manipulate the crowd, to keep them entertained and obedient. Nero's need for attention led him to use the arena as a tool to secure his own legacy, at the expense of anyone who got in his way. The emperors who took center stage in the arena were not just rulers. They were showmen, creating spectacles where they were both the stars and the directors. They used the arena as a personal playground, not only for political power, but for vanity and self-gratification. Each performance was their way of reminding the people of their absolute control over life and death. But as history shows, this obsession with the arena came at a cost. These emperors, consumed by their need for attention, often alienated those around them. Commodus's obsession with the arena eventually led to his assassination, and Caligula's erratic behavior ended with his violent death. The arena, which had once symbolized their power, became the stage for their downfall. The gladiatorial games were more than just a brutal form of entertainment. They were a powerful tool of political control, used to keep the masses loyal to the empire. Roman emperors understood the games were not just about bloodshed. They were a way to distract the people, offering them a temporary escape from the harsh realities of life in a crumbling empire. The games served as a spectacle that united the masses, gave them something to cheer for, and reminded them of who held the power. The games were state-sponsored, funded by the emperor and magistrates. These events were not just a way to pass the time, they were a means of political manipulation. The rulers used them to keep the people entertained and distracted, preventing them from focusing on the growing problems in Rome. Whether it was the empire's expanding debts, political instability, or the cracks in its military, the games provided a temporary escape from the fears hanging over Roman society. Imagine a Roman citizen attending the games at the Colosseum. The violence, the bloodshed, and the spectacle of death were meant to capture their attention, to keep them from questioning the emperor's authority. The gladiators, animals, and condemned criminals were part of the performance. But the real purpose of the games was not just the fight or the blood spilled. It served as a reminder of the emperor's absolute control over life and death. The emperor wasn't just the ruler of the people. He was their god, the master of all life. The games also had a profound cultural impact on Roman society. The people became desensitized to violence. What was once considered barbaric became normal. Children grew up watching these brutal spectacles, their first lesson in the power of the emperor and the state. Violence, death, and suffering became part of everyday life, woven into the fabric of Roman culture. The games reinforced the social order. Gladiators were often slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war, those at the bottom of society. Forcing them to fight for the public's entertainment sent a clear message. These people were expendable, less than human, merely pawns in a game designed to showcase Rome's might. The elite watched from elevated seats, reinforcing the idea that they were above the violence, the bloodshed, and the common people. Yet, despite the clear divide between the ruling class and the spectators, the games also served to unite the people. No matter their social status, everyone in the crowd cheered for the same gladiators, the same animals, and the same victories. The games blurred the lines between the wealthy and the poor. It was an event that brought Romans together, even if only for a brief moment, under the emperor's watchful eye. The games were also a way for emperors to assert their power. They used the events to celebrate military victories, reaffirm their strength, and remind the people of their control over the empire. The more extravagant the games, the more they reinforced the emperor's image as a powerful ruler who could protect his people, entertain them, and demonstrate his dominance. However, the games also had a darker side. As the empire began to weaken and resources to fund these grand events became scarcer, the games grew more desperate. Emperors like Caligula and Nero, obsessed with their image, saw the arena as a way to keep the people's attention focused on them, rather than on the growing problems within the empire. But, as history shows, this obsession led to their downfall. The games, which once symbolized Roman strength, began to represent a decaying empire, where the rulers had lost control of their own fate. The gladiatorial games were one of the most important cultural institutions in ancient Rome. They were more than just entertainment. They were an extension of the emperor's rule, a way to remind the people of Rome's dominance over life, death, and everything in between. But as the empire crumbled, the games lost their meaning. What was once a symbol of strength became a symbol of decline. The people who had once cheered for the bloodshed began to question whether the empire and its spectacles of cruelty were worth supporting. As we reflect on the bloodthirsty spectacles of ancient Rome, we must ask ourselves, what lessons can we draw from this dark history? The gladiatorial games were not just brutal events of violence, they were a reflection of the empire's obsession with power and control. The question remains, how did Rome's use of such violent entertainment shape the way we view power, entertainment, and even violence in modern times? Rome used the arena to entertain, distract, and control the masses. The emperor, through these bloody spectacles, reminded the people of his absolute dominance, not just over life and death, but over their very thoughts and actions. As we look at this manipulation of power, we must consider how entertainment today continues to be used as a tool of distraction. Do we, like the Romans, allow ourselves to become desensitized to violence in the media or the entertainment industry? The moral lesson from Rome's violent past is not just about the spectacle of death, but about the use of cruelty for control. It reminds us that when power is unchecked and unchallenged, it can turn even the most sacred parts of life like entertainment into a tool for oppression. How far have we come from Rome in recognizing the dangers of desensitizing ourselves to violence for the sake of entertainment? We encourage you to think about the darkest aspects of Roman spectacles. Was it the sheer cruelty, or the fact that these events were used to manipulate and control the population? In what ways do we see echoes of Roman power and manipulation in today's world? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think was the most chilling part of these Roman spectacles? And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into dark history.